Hello, and welcome to the Kathleen Spracklin podcast. I am a woman on a mission to help you get the Zettelkasten of your dreams on your work table beside you. Whoa, are we going to have a good one tonight? We are continuing with our series of analytical reading following all the steps and stages of Adler's procedure. And we are on the third phase, the actual analytical reading, and the fifth step. Now, as we've been going through, these steps have been little kind of like tiptoes, it felt like, just little bits. But boy, tonight we hit the jackpot. There's a good chunk that we're going to tackle tonight. We're working with Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, a spectacular book. If you don't have this in your library, you're going to really want to have it because it covers all the bases. And in particular, I'm doing my analytical reading on Hold On, You Lost Me by Bernice McCarthy and Jacqueline O'Neill Blackwell. And it's turning out to be quite an interesting book to read analytically. So let's head on over to the down-facing camera and we'll take a look at step 5. Finally, we get a step that's really meaty. In fact, this one is actually meat and potatoes. Come on over. Hey, here we are, ready to continue our series on analytical reading. And I've got my bib card on a ring ready to go. And we are ready to work from step 5 in analytical reading. Come to terms with the author. Identify the terms and define them. Like so many steps in analytical reading, this phase 3, we're finding that in the pre-reading, we did something that was very helpful to us in leading up to this analytical reading. And in step 3 of pre-reading, we checked out the index, we paid attention to the range of topics covered, and we began picking out the key terms. Well, that work that I did back in pre-reading the book is going to come in very handy today when I'm tackling the analytical reading step of actually defining the terms, because this time all you needed to do was pick them out. You didn't have to really know what they meant, and you just found them in the index and assembled them. So this is what it looked like back when I was doing that step where I was supposed to pick out the key terms. And when you look at something alphabetically, the terms come in rather random order, but they seem to have some parallels. I began to pick up on things that came in groups of 4. And so instead of just accepting this list of terms as it was shaping up, I began to gather the terms in an organized manner. That turned out to be very helpful, because this is what I found back then, was that there were 4 types that answered questions like why, how, if, what, and they seemed to have different terms that were associated with them. And so I realized that I was going to be finding something about imaginative learners and analytical learners and common sense learners and dynamic learners. And then I found out that there were going to be 4 stages in the learning process: engage, share, practice, perform, and that those were going to be divided into 8 individual steps. So this one page gathered quite an enormous collection of terms. Besides that collection, I also found some terms that were just hanging around in smaller collections, like this pair, analyze and synthesize. 3 kinds of engagement, a whole bunch of different learning things that I had to sort out: a learning method, learning style, learning cycle, learning stage. They all had to be deciphered separately. And then I found a couple of terms relating to assessment: at the gate assessment, on the way assessment. So that was the list that I had going in to work from. So today, when it was my job to actually not just list them, but to define each one of them, what I did was I took that list from when I created them for the pre-reading, and I just looked them up in page number order. So I considered the first terms in the order in which they appeared in the book, because I figured that would give me them from the most basic to the most involved. And it turned out to be a very good choice, because early on I discovered that I had a few terms that I did not pick up from the index. These are common words that the author was using in a very specific way. For example, perceive. there's several different definitions possible for perceive, but Bernice McCarthy appears to be using it specifically for how we attain an awareness or an understanding. So she's using one particular sense of perceive. And then there's another key phrase for her, the preference for perceiving. And she breaks that down into two kinds, sensing and feeling, which she talks about gaining experience, versus thinking and judging, which she describes as being a sort of a research method. So she's basically saying that the way that we attain an awareness or understanding of the universe is going to put us into one of two categories, either the sensing and feeling or the thinking and judging category. At this stage, I'm not called upon to evaluate whether two covers it all. My job is just now to capture the author's terms and determine how the author uses the terms. So besides perceiving, process is another term that is used rather specifically, which in its meaning to subject to a treatment. And again, McCarthy talks about having a preference for processing. And it breaks down into two groups. She says it relates to the amount of time spent reflecting versus experimenting. And her labels for the two possibilities are watching and doing. So those are terms for her. Then the next, in page number order, the next term was learning style. And McCarthy points out that if you take the two preferences for perceiving and you cross them with the two preferences for processing, you're going to end up with 4 different groups, which she says are the 4 learning styles. Well, each of the learning style is not only a key term in itself, but is actually a mini collection of key terms. So, for example, and this struck me as very strange at the time, was why would you start with type 4 and then go to type 1? That threw me for a little bit of a loop. But nevertheless, we now have a collection of terms defined vis-a-vis this chart. Type 4 learning style is the combination of feeling as your method of perceiving and doing as your method of processing. And she labels this dynamic learners. This is her term, dynamic learners. And she asserts that this is the if, or sometimes what if. She uses if and what if interchangeably for the question that learners of this type are most likely to want to ask. Type 1 learners approach perceiving from a feeling perspective and doing from the perspective of standing back and watching for a bit before getting involved. She uses the term imaginative learners to describe this quadrant, and she asserts that they are most likely to want to answer the question why. For type 2 learners, these represent learners who approach perceiving with a thinking approach and approach processing with a watching or laid back and look at things first. She labels this group analytic learning, and that's a key term, and she asserts that they are wanting to ask the question, what? Our third quadrant are those who approach perceiving from a thinking approach and approach processing from a doing perspective. She says that these are the common sense learners. That's her key term for this group. And she asserts that they are trying to answer the how questions. At other times, she refers to this group as the hands-on learners. So she seems to have 2 key terms that she applies to this same group. My next key term was a standalone term, but an extremely important one for this book, the format model learning cycle. And so I took the author's definition verbatim. This is a quote. It's in blue, and that tells me it's a quote. A 4-part model that explains how learning happens. The book goes on to explain that there are 4 stages in the format model, and those 4 stages correspond to the 4 types of learners. The 4 stages are named engage, share, practice, and perform. So those are key terms for the author. Engage, she asserts, is the preferred learning style for the imaginative type 1 learner, the learner who wants to know why. Type 2 share, she asserts, is the preferred learning stage for the analytic or type 2 learner who wants to know the question what. Stage 3 of learning, practice, is the stage of learning that hands-on learners or type 3 learners most enjoy, and it answers the question how. The fourth and final stage of the 4-stage model, perform, is the favorite stage of the dynamic learner, the type 4 learner, and it answers the question, what if? She also refers to these 4 stages as 4 quadrants, and rarely, but sometimes refers to them as the 4 phases. So having finally learned what is meant by the learning model, then I tackled the term learning method. This is defined as the techniques that tend to work best at each learning stage. So now we have learning model, learning stage, learning method, lots of learnings going on. Not surprising, this is about training. And so I made a simple chart relating the stage of learning versus the methods that work best for that stage. And that's the definition of learning method. The next pair of terms that I had identified in my pre-reading were analysis versus synthesis. So I learned that she also refers to analysis as left mode and synthesis as right mode. And this is what's going on in the learning process. Left mode learning is when the left hemisphere of the brain is dominant, and she defines it as using language, abstract concepts, and has a number sense and is sequential. She contrasts that with synthesis. You're engaging in synthesis when you're learning, when you're primarily using the right hemisphere of the brain, and that's operating out of a sense of being, and comprehends images and seeks patterns and creates metaphors and is simultaneous rather than sequential. Then she uses these 2 terms to talk about the steps of the learning cycle. Remember earlier we encountered the 4 stages in the learning cycle. Now we find out that for each of the 4 stages of the learning cycle in the format model learning cycle, there are going to be 2 steps, a left brain mode step and a right brain mode step. And here's how all of those 8 steps are defined. It charts it out from the stage to whether it's left or right mode. Then they're given step numbers from 1 to 8, and they're each given a name. And then I've captured a very brief description of what the step is. I found it uncomfortable that practice was both a stage and one of the steps in the stage, and likewise perform is both a stage and one of the steps in the stage. This stage, I was ready to work on the terms regarding assessment. I had expected to define terms at the gate assessment and on the way assessment. But what I discovered when I got into the chapter itself where these were defined, that there were some important key terms that were defined ahead of these 2 terms, and these were subterms within those other more important terms that I had not picked up out of the index. Chief among them is this term, the Kirkpatrick model for evaluation and assessment. And the reason I didn't pick that up out of the index is quite simple. There's no mention of a Kirkpatrick method. There's only a person. And there's a bunch of other people whose last names began with K. And so I did not pick this up as being a key term. And the idea of the Kirkpatrick model is that it's a way of measuring the effectiveness of your training. And it starts from how the participants assess the value that they believe they gained. It's very subjective. And then it's trying to objectively determine how much they actually learned, possibly through pre- and post-test scores. And then there's an attempt to measure the transfer. To what degree are the participants in the training actually using what they learned in the training for their work? Does it transfer over to their workday, or was it just a fun day away from the job? And finally, the level 4 assesses the value to the company, the actual result. Are the learners actually now more productive than they had been? Are they leading to higher profits for the company? So this is at the company level. Was the training worthwhile? At the employee level, did it give them something useful? At the assessment level, did they actually learn what the instructor was trying to teach them? And did the employees themselves think it was valuable? So those are the different levels of assessment. And now I can define the on the way assessment and at the gate assessment. The on the way assessment is the assessment that takes place during the learning cycle, while the at the gate assessment takes place either at the very end of the learning cycle or after the training is completed. Now the only terms that remained to be defined are those three having to do with engagement. So I began with the meaning of engagement itself as McCarthy uses it, and engagement are techniques for generating and facilitating energy in a learning experience. And these vary based on the stage of the learning cycle that you're in. And the engagement is broken down into three types: social engagement, emotional engagement, and physical engagement. These are all key terms for McCarthy, and so I picked up on her definitions. And then each of these three types of engagement is further broken down by learning stage, but those do not yield any new key terms. It's simply part of what's going to be learned in the analytical reading. So this completed my exercise of identifying and defining the author's terms. Well, I had an awful lot of fun with that exercise. I finally felt like I had something I could really sink my teeth into, and I really felt like I'm getting somewhere with that book, even though I have not actually started any kind of sequential reading of the book, even still. But I think one of the things that I wanted to share with you that impressed me so much about Adler's method is the way in which it takes the tension off the processes. For example, back when I was pre-reading the book, I was asked to look through the index and pick out the key terms. I wasn't asked to define them. I wasn't asked to understand how they fit into the author's argument. I wasn't asked to describe what they were used for. I was just asked to pick them out and name them. And I did, and I took it to one more level, and that is I tried to organize them and group similar ones together. And that's all I had to do. So it was very simple and fun and light. Well, this time, when I launched into the part with analytical reading, I was indeed asked to define the terms, but I didn't have to go find them because there they all were. So this time, all I had to do was take them one by one, look them up in the index to find the right page, and figure out the definition for that term. So each one was super, super, super simple. And the method that I used to organize them onto my bib card was page number order. I would find that all the terms in one group were about in the same area of the book. And so I started with the ones that were way in the front and then moved my way through the book so that the bib card actually makes a reasonable projection. And that enabled me to build on the terms that I had patiently defined in the earlier sections. For example, the different styles of perceiving and the different styles of processing got built into a cross chart. The two of each, yes, no on the one, yes, no on the other. Now you've got four choices. And those were the four learning styles. So that built. And then finding out that the four stages in the learning cycle corresponded to the four learning styles. Whoa, nice. And then I went on further and I learned that there was the left hemisphere, right hemisphere part was going to take part in the learning cycle. And then I learned that for each of the four stages, there was going to be a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere step in each of the four stages. So now I knew why I went from 4 stages to 8 steps. And then what was left after that? What was left after that was evaluation. How do you determine whether you've done a good job? And then the final thing had to do with engagement. And engagement showed up in that chapter that almost felt like a bonus chapter, how to improve your delivery based on what you've learned from the learning cycle. So I still haven't done any actual sitting down with a book and reading every word of it, but wow, am I ever getting a fantastic framework, and I've really got those key terms already, so that when I read her writing where she talks about how and why and the way it works and the way things come together, I'm not going to be trying to do 2 things at once. I'm not going to be trying to both learn the terms and then learn what she's saying vis-a-vis those terms. I already know the terms, so now all I need to do is see what point she's making about them. Fabulous. It just breaks everything down and makes it so easy. And that's one of the reasons why I think that this book has such a well-deserved reputation. It's just, and the English, it's just delightful to read the way Mortimer Adler puts words together. It's just fun. So join me next time when I take on the next step in analytical reading. See you then. Bye-bye.